And I'm going to say welcome again, and a very, very big welcome to our guest speaker today, Dr. Megan Laws, whom I'm particularly excited to welcome because, unfortunately, she was unable to give us a talk as planned last term due to the horrible plague that's currently reshaping our world. So welcome, Megan. We're really glad that you could make it and talk to us about your research this term. Megan is currently affiliated with two different departments. She's currently a fellow in the anthropology department at the LSE, but she's also affiliated with the Department of Geography at UCL, where she works with an interdisciplinary team who work with marginalized communities to develop digital tools for collecting geo-reference data. I need to look this one up on a range of social and ecological issues. But Megan herself is an anthropologist who specializes in the anthropology of Southern Africa. And I believe that she's going to use this talk to draw together both these aspects of her research trajectory today. So welcome, Megan, and I'll give the floor to you now.
Thank you so much, Leanna. So yes, thank you for inviting me to present today, and also thank you to Anna Tuckett, who invited me originally, who also came from LSE. I'm not sure if she's in the crowd at the moment, but thank you to Anna. So I had originally planned to present a chapter from my thesis, and Leanna then contacted me more recently and sort of asked if I might be interested in doing a kind of less traditional academic talk to kind of show what anthropology might look like or do or kind of be beyond the confines of the academy. So I've kind of jumped at this opportunity because it is something that I've been trying to get my head around and kind of commit myself for quite some time. So as Leanna said, my primary position is as a teaching and research fellow in the Department of Anthropology, and my anthropological research really looks at how kind of doubt or experiences of doubt and uncertainty sort of shape approaches to sharing or the many practices kind of ordinarily associated with egalitarianism among Jul'hoan speakers in northeastern Namibia. So that's kind of my primary anthropological research. But as Leanna said, I'm also a researcher in an interdisciplinary research group in the Department of Geography. And this research group is called EXCITES, which is shorthand for Extreme Citizen Science. And the central aim of the group is really to develop kind of open source mobile data collection and data visualization tools that are both kind of accessible to people ordinarily excluded from the kind of scientific work that affects their lives and their livelihoods, and tools that are kind of fully customizable so that those who are ordinarily excluded from this work can actually design these tools according to their own needs, or design projects kind of according to their own needs. So this talk is really kind of interested in the relationship between these areas of research, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. So just quickly, the research grant that we're working on, just to give a bit more context to this research group, because I will kind of go into the anthropology sort of side of this and the actual research that I'm thinking about. And then towards the end of the talk, I'll kind of bring it back to this research project. So this just to say that the research grant that we are working on at the moment is funded by the European Research Council, as you can see on the slide. And the project has another kind of silly shorthand called EXANVIS, which stands for Extreme Citizen Science Analysis and Visualization. It's the second kind of large grant that this research group has worked on. The first of them saw the team sort of create specifically create a data collection tool, which is called Sapelli Collector. I'll link, hopefully we can link some of this stuff. And this second grant has seen them start to develop a data visualization and analysis kind of platform, which we're calling Sapelli Viewer. So I will talk a little bit more about that. But I just want to say that the context for applying for this major grant was sort of seeing that the earlier researchers sort of found that while there was a lot of enthusiasm for collecting data, this work was kind of almost meaningless if people on the ground were not also supported in visualizing and analyzing the data that they collected, which is really important for kind of what I'm going to talk about today. So without this function, kind of, data visualization or analysis, local people are able to collect data they want to collect, which is great, but they are kind of marginalized from viewing it and working with it and really using it either using it in certain kind of projects, but also just using it as a starting point for conversation, which is usually where these sorts of tools are really useful. So more recently though, and this is sort of stepping away from the kind of data visualization and analysis, some members of the research group, so myself and also Marcus Moreo, who I've put on the slide today because he's really been kind of central to this research, although more from a kind of technical and GIS sort of perspective. But we've sort of started to reflect upon not only this issue of providing data visualization and analysis, but also thinking about the types of data that people are able to collect. And in the beginning, or at the moment, even with Sapedi Collector, these are really limited to what GIS kind of people call point data, just self-explanatory. So it's sort of data that are associated with single GPS points rather than being things like lines or pathways or areas, which again, this is sort of what this talk is mostly about. So just to be a bit clear on that, there we go. So we've started to reflect on how to work with these different points of data, beyond point data, such as lines and polygons. So much of this impetus kind of came from the needs as they were expressed by people we work with. And as much as I can see kind of the many uses for these tools and for collecting lines and polygon data, just in carrying out ethnographic research, which I'm happy to talk about in the question and answer, we've kind of limited ourselves in this case to focusing on these functionalities that people say they would like to experiment with. This is an important part of kind of the methodology of the research group. So yes, with the team having initially prioritized, developing a tool that would allow people to collect point data, as anthropologists have often found, the team found that people often valued or emphasized the kind of relationships between these points that they were collecting, right? So relationships between entities rather than the relationship and even the relationships kind of that those points kind of index, rather than the entities themselves, right? That was so. If we talk less abstractly, if a certain person who's using this tool was to gather information about animals or about trees or anything that it might be, they were interested in the kind of relationships that those entities represent, or the stories that they told, and those sorts of things. So adding these kind of lines and polygons was not, this is not just sort of saying that people are interested in kind of paths or plots of land, but that it extended further than that to say that people were interested in relationships, networks, and the kind of territories, let's say, that index kind of complex human relationships. So that's really where this kind of emphasis or this development within the tool kind of springs from. So this was made particularly clear to us, in the research group, specifically in Namibia, when we started collaborating with a group of rangers or kind of eco-guards within northeastern Namibia who are tasked with reporting on animal sightings and incidents of kind of own use hunting or evidence of poaching within the region, right? So they move through this region that you can see here, and they report if they see an animal, but they also talk to people within the region who might have hunted an animal, and then they record that, or they might find evidence of poaching and they record that. So central to this work that they were doing was being able to map the kind of pathways that they took through the region that crossed over different territories. But also associating a particular sighting of an animal, which is, what the points that you can see here, with a particular territory, right? So this is because kind of own use hunting is permitted within this region, right? So hunting for themselves, for subsistence, is permitted within this region according to kind of certain regulations, but only within one owns territory and not kind of outside of it, right? This is quite complex, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but it was sort of the starting point for thinking about how a sighting of an animal says so much more about kind of relationships between people and between people and animals than kind of is represented in this kind of point, this kind of quite simple map of animal sightings. So the discussion, around this quickly grew to be about how the tools could be used to map actual territories or human relationships in the same way that they had done kind of in the lead up to Namibian independence, which is something that I will talk about again, the kind of participatory mapping processes that were really central to this transition into kind of post-apartheid Namibia. So, and from there, to how it sort of developed further to how an important part of the work would be mapping, people's relationships to one another and by extension to the territories within which they lived and within which they hunted and kind of moved. So I'll talk more about this in the third part of the talk. And for now, I just want to highlight that this poses kind of a number of technical and kind of design challenges for the team, for Excites, who are made up not only of anthropologists like me, but GIS scientists and human-computer interaction specialists and developers and those sorts of things. But what I'm interested here is a number of kind of conceptual challenges that strike at the core of this broader endeavor to kind of develop accessible and customizable digital tools that assist people in their kind of ongoing efforts to monitor and report on issues that matter to them, right? And most notably, this is in kind of asking what might actually come of this work for people on the ground, right? So there's the sort of more, simple, but by no means easy work of kind of developing these tools that collect point data and collect lines and polygons and that sort of thing. And then there's the kind of broader conceptual work of kind of, well, how do you draw an ethnography to sort of think through the way that these tools might be used, but also sort of what might come of this work after that if people were to kind of start mapping relationships and that sort of thing. And that's really what this talk is about. So a long kind of diatribe to start with, but that's kind of what I'm focusing on. So this paper kind of approaches this issue of or this question of what might actually come of this work from the perspective of one, such case study in northeastern Namibia, which, as mentioned, is where Jul'hoan speakers live and where we've sort of discussed the possibilities of using these tools to map their ancestral territories. So there's lots to cover. I just want to go back to the title slide briefly, just to thank a few people before we begin. So I'd like to thank the Jun'hoan of the Nainai Conservancy of Namibia, who since 2014 have been nothing but hospitable to me and more recently to the rest of the team within the Department of Geography, and who've put up with many delays that have come from busy academic schedules, overwhelming bureaucracy often, and long distance kind of technical challenges. I'd also like to thank the government of the Republic of Namibia, and in particular the Jul'hoan Traditional Authority of Chumkwe District East, for their guidance and support and for issuing us with permits that allowed us to do this work. I'd also like to thank Marcus Moreo, who is a fellow team member at UCL and who is not presenting with me today, as said, but who is essentially a co-author of this paper. So again, this research was funded by the ESRC, and I need to say that it is under the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme. The details of this grant are in the small text in the slide here. It was also funded in part by the Economic and Social Research Council, who funded my PhD research within the region. So as the title suggests, this paper is about local concepts of territory. So within Southern Africa, discussions surrounding territory, of course, bring to mind scores of debates surrounding land tenure and land use following the end of apartheid. And this is a topic that I suspect people in the audience might, or some people in the audience might know more about than I do. I am just beginning to engage with this literature, and so I do not cite it here. Or not cite much of it here, and I'm really just beginning on this project. So this is a small kind of disclaimer from me. So I welcome very kind of candid reflections on the ideas presented here. It's more of a proposal at the moment than it is a paper. So in the absence of proper findings, I focus here on the specific history of the Nainai Conservancy and the participatory mapping processes that were kind of central to its formation. And so participatory mapping here is by no means new, especially within this region, but new developments in kind of in digital technologies do pose kind of new opportunities for doing participatory mapping a bit differently, which is sort of what I've spoken about already. So that's kind of what I'm interested in. So, and those are the two sort of things that I'll focus on to start with. So in thinking about doing participatory mapping differently and in light of kind of local discussions, I found it helpful to kind of return to my ethnographic research and to broader kind of ethnographic writing on Jul'hoan concepts of territory and forms of relatedness upon which these kind of territories are based. So I will also be talking about this, and before kind of returning to this discussion of, or this you know, the work that the research group at UCL is doing and the kind of ethical and technical challenges that are posed by it. So to start with, I want to focus on the kind of history of this place, and in particular the sort of land tenure and management system and how it's formed over time. So there are several key moments in this history of this region that are worth mentioning, and these include first the Odendaal Commission of 1964 and kind of earlier acts such as the Natives Land Act of 1913 and the Population Registration Act of 1950, which led to the homeland system under the apartheid regime of South Africa. This is a really important part of this history, which I'll talk about. I'll then talk a little bit about the back to the land movement in the 1970s within this region, and to Namibia's independence from the apartheid regime and how the use of land kind of changed during that period. And after the kind of the first National Land Reform Conference of 1991, and there's just been a second National Land Reform Conference. So it's sort of, this talk is really placed within in that history. I'm sort of thinking about the future of land use and land tenure within this region in relation to these ongoing debates. And then finally to the Nature Conservation Amendment Act, which was kind of very central to the formation of this region as a conservancy, which again, I'll talk about. So that is the kind of historical context of this. So what these earlier acts did, to the kind of division of Namibia into these so-called homelands or native reserves, that's sort of what the longer trajectory of these acts is into the formation of these kind of homelands, which you can see in the map opposite, right? So the map on the left is a map of the kind of homeland system that was a kind of outcome of all of these acts that I've sort of referenced, sorry. So what happened here really is that people were, a lot of people might know this history, but I think it's worth kind of going over a little bit. So what happened is that, these areas of Namibia were, that they were divided into homelands, and people were kind of segregated, into these different spaces. Now, the region that I'm focused on, which is called Bushman, or was called Bushman land, which you can see in the map opposite, was actually one that ended up sort of, it was regarded as a kind of a space for what was called a wastebasket category. So any kind of ethnic group, as it was defined, without a recognized government or leader. So it was really kind of like a catch-all sort of space, homeland, where they would put anyone who they didn't think had their own kind of recognized leader. And there were different sort of levels of independence of these specific homelands. So it is no surprise that groups such as the Jul'hoan thought at the time to be kind of entirely nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers who were non-hierarchical and kind of sexually egalitarian, were placed into this kind of more general category. So by that time, which was the mid-1970s actually at this point, before it formally became a homeland, not only had most of the region's inhabitants been recruited into the South African Defence Force as trackers for the apartheid government, which is obviously quite different to kind of the rest of the region. They had also sort of resettled into an administrative town at the region's centre, and sort of far from their territories where they had lived before. So the map on the right is actually a much later map sort of in the late 1990s, but it sort of shows the town in the center, where basically, if you imagine anyone who was living on in that wider region had sort of been resettled into this one town or in the army bases further west and further north. So a few years after this period, in the late 1970s or 1976, the ethnographic filmmaker John Marshall returned to the region after kind of being declared a persona non grata for nearly 20 years. He'd first come to the Nainai region in 1950 with his family on an expedition funded by the Peabody Museum. And he stayed where at that time he had stayed for 8 years, carrying out extensive kind of ethnographic research with his family, especially his mother, Lorna Marshall, who was an anthropologist who wrote extensively about kind of Jul'hoan territory customs and all sorts of things. So upon his return in 1978, he was kind of disturbed by what he saw and by what people reported, about problems of hunger or poor health and violence. And he facilitated a kind of back to the land movement that ultimately would see the kind of region's inhabitants kind of regain access to these ancestral lands, or ancestral kind of specific ancestral territories. If the people within the region were to regain their ancestral territories, kind of so it went, that the apartheid regime had, threatened at the time to actually turn into a large game reserve or region for professional hunting, they would need to have a kind of clear proposal for its use and management, but also kind of clear evidence that they were in fact the kind of ancestral title holders for this region, meaning the Jul'hoan. So it was sort of this that began this kind of first participatory mapping project, which is really central to the kind of broader work that I'm going to speak about territory. And as was customary at the time, it would detail, the ways in which land and its resources were being used as a basis for some form of tenure in the future, right? An anticipated possible form of tenure in the future, in the kind of post-apartheid future, right? So even if this would only be kind of de facto rights rather than kind of formal tenure rights, it would give them access to this kind of region. So they used paper maps, they carried out extensive kind of interviews and surveys, and later used sort of GPS technology, which was just being developed around that time, to map what were locally known as Noresi, which I'm loosely translating here as territory, and which I'll talk a little bit more about later. So shortly after Namibia's independence from the apartheid regime of South Africa, and the first kind of national land conference of 1991 that I mentioned before, a series of acts were passed that further kind of assisted in this process by making it easier for people to claim kind of collective rights as members of the same community. So these acts allow groups of people to form traditional communities defined in terms of the kind of common recognition of a traditional authority, right, who in turn kind of presided over a region that the wider community kind of claimed ancestral rights to, right? So there were structures that were put in place that would essentially ensure that people gained kind of political self-determination. So the participatory mapping process played a crucial role in this, and it was central to kind of gaining this status, because it proved that there were these certain permanent features that, as they were written in the kind of legislation, that included things like hills, rivers, kind of roads that had a long kind of history of use or occupation. So this would ultimately result in the establishment of the region as kind of communal lands, but it would not necessarily give people much of a say in the way that the land and its resources were kind of used and managed, right? So it would just sort of establish a kind of communal lands, but not necessarily kind of show how they were used. So you can see in these maps that the sort of pinkish color on the right map is traditional, has kind of land control by traditional authorities. And then in the map on the left, you can see the kind of broader constituency sort of areas. So the brown one being the Otjiwazenjupa region, within which the conservancy kind of sits. So I should probably hurry up with this actually. So the the main point of this is that, you know, it would give people political self-determination, but it wouldn't give them the possibility of kind of economic emancipation. There had to also be some sort of model for making this kind of space profitable for people. And the Nature Conservation Amendment Act of 1996 was passed that gave traditional communities the right to kind of gain conservancy status. And by granting this conservancy status, the aim was to provide for a kind of economically based system of sustainable management and utilization of game in communal areas, right? So the Naina Conservancy, which I'm talking about today, was the first of its kind and served as a model for other regions that then followed similar measures in their own efforts to regain rights to ancestral territories. So what's interesting here, I think, is that there's sort of two things happening here between like having a kind of political self-determination and then the actual way in which this land is going to be used. So there's a process of participatory mapping that gives title, you know, some form of title to individual territory holders. And then there's a conservancy that kind of that these individual sort of title holders work with in order to manage this land kind of collectively, right? That's really what you need to know about this. So there's a paper by Saskia Vermeulen and co-authors, and they write, you know, just broadly about this kind of participatory mapping process, that this is not a specific history, but in fact, you know, quite a general one. So to stand a chance of reclaiming their kind of pre-colonial rights, indigenous peoples often have to deploy the tools and logic of the colonial state. So that's what Saskia and Vermeulen and co-authors write. So land use and tenure rights, in other words, as they were granted by governments, are often granted on the basis of these largely kind of fixed features of the landscape. In this case, kind of prominent trees, hills, fossilized dunes, and so on. So what is interesting about this case is first, you know, just how closely these maps reflect the Ngore land use system they were based upon, right, in this participatory mapping process. So that question. And second, kind of what the effects would be if it actually really did closely reflect the Ngore land use system. So what I'm kind of claiming here is that it sort of partially does that, and that's really what I want to kind of talk more about. So just to give a very brief indication of this, and before going into more depth on this Ngore land use system and on the kind of new experiments in participatory mapping and their possible effects, it's worth noting what the conservancy kind of looks like today. So it remains a communal conservancy in the kind of northeastern corner of what is now known as the Otjozondjupa constituency. And it's approximately kind of 9,000 square kilometers in size, and there are roughly kind of 4,000 people living in the region. So very kind of sparsely populated. Most of the region's inhabitants are Jul'hoan speakers, but a sizable number are migrants from other parts of the country. So over Herero speakers, Oshivambo, Damara, and Kavango speakers. So where the region's Jul'hoan residents are the kind of primary custodians of the region, and live mostly at their ancestral territories in the conservancy itself, which you can see some of these dots on the map to the right that indicate specific territories or villages, right? The rest of the region's inhabitants live in Chumkwe, so in that one at the center you should be able to see. So they run businesses, work as civil servants, and that sort of thing. And this is because the nature of the kind of Ngore land use system dictates that only the kind of direct descendants of those with claims to ancestral territories, as they were kind of mapped out in the 80s and 90s, or in rare cases, kind of new applicants to ancestral territories, are able to establish themselves within the conservancy. So this obviously allows the residents to retain access to land, which is absolutely vital, and it protects them from the kind of willing buyer, willing seller kind of processes that people fear would kind of lead inevitably to the kind of breaking up of parcels of land and so on. It also means that ancestral territories have remained kind of largely static, which is something that I'm kind of looking into in this paper. So I'm wagering kind of somewhat tentatively that this basically the original participatory mapping process and its adoption of the Ngore land use system in a kind of partial way has had a number of effects on families within the region and on territories, but also on kind of patterns of sharing. And it's these effects that I want to explore in more depth towards the end of this paper. So before I do that, I would like to focus on the Ngore land use system and its relationship to kind of Jul'hoan concepts of relatedness. So the Naina Conservancy has been visited by a large number of anthropologists over the years. Just over the border to the east in Botswana is the famous site of the Dobe Kong that Richard Lee wrote about in the 1960s and 70s. And though these communities are now kind of separated by a stark border, they were once kind of one larger community of Jul'hoan speakers, and many still kind of visit one another as sort of close relatives. So they also, this research obviously perhaps most famously appeared in Marshall Sahlins' essay on the original affluent society, but most extensively in the kind of ethnographic writing of Lorna Marshall, who I've mentioned before. And since then, they've appeared in numerous other ethnographies. So the point I'm trying to make is that these ethnographies actually paint like quite a consistent picture of sort of certain traditions of sharing and of certain relationships to land or territory. And these are really in accordance with my own ethnographic research carried out between 2014. So I'm given the time restrictions, of which there are a lot now, I will do quite a bit of simplifying here. But the main point is that these sort of rules that I'm talking about, which don't necessarily map perfectly onto social life, come through quite consistently throughout this research, and people talk about them quite explicitly within Jul'hoan. People talk about them quite explicitly. So what I am interested in is sort of saying the Ngore land use system is, discussed in depth by these, several ethnographers, and the practices of sharing are also discussed by several ethnographers. But I think more can kind of be done to bring these together, sort of to analyze them in relation to one another in a similar way to sort of what I'm proposing about, points, lines, and polygons, and then really considering what the relationship between each of these issues are. So we know a lot about concepts of territory, and we know a lot about different ways that Jul'hoan people describe themselves as being kind of related to one another, and the kind of rules that govern their interactions on this basis, but less on the kind of bearing that these forms of relatedness have on territory and on ownership today. That doesn't come through in these kind of maps that are the outcome of kind of participatory mapping exercises. And I'm really wondering, like, could they kind of come through more strongly, and what would that entail, and what would it mean? So this is something that Saskia Vermeulen et al. Do in their recent paper on this land use system and on traditions of gift exchange, but they only provide kind of a partial analysis because they focus specifically on gift exchange, which, as I'll show, is just one part of a kind of broader set of forms of relatedness. So here, what I want to do is really reflect on the kind of broader argument they make, and draw attention to the kind of challenges of these counter mapping exercises like the ones that I'm engaged in, and also to the kind of silences of the map. So to those aspects of kind of local relationships that are not captured by standard approaches to mapping. So what is this land use system, Ngore land use system? As said, it is very complicated, and probably more complicated than I'm able to capture, but some kind of key features which distinguish it from sort of tenure systems that give deeds to either single or joint title holders are quite clear. So it's a communal system, which means that while each Ngore is said to have an owner, and these are typically kind of the eldest men or women of that kind of village or of that family or community, or perhaps the most kind of highly respected, anyone related to these owners actually carries the same basic title as members or custodians over that territory. So the Ngore is a, you can see this in the second bit, is a kind of named place for any kind of named place with a source of water or resources of bush foods or that sort of thing. So it's any place like this that a family in question kind of claim to have ancestral rights to, and which other people within the region as well similarly recognize, right? So they will recognize that those people have rights to that region just on the basis of kind of long-term use. So as I've said, I've translated this as territory, but it is worth noting that this term is somewhat misleading as it denotes kind of a somewhat sort of bounded plot. And the Ngore is often described as kind of, not having sort of clear boundaries. So this is actually an open question for me, in fact, and something I'm keen to kind of figure out, which is why I'm using the term territory. And, to me, it seems well suited to this concept of the Ngore, because the plot, as Jul'hoan speakers call it, is quite stable in terms of the relationships it indexes at any one time, right? So the borders might be fuzzy in the sense that from one year to the next, the resource kind of shifts, but there is something more fixed to those relationships of kind of ownership at any one time. So in addition to these, more general territories that are based on sources of water resources, there is also the Chutho, which is a kind of type of Ngore or a part of a wider Ngore, which quite simply is just the home, or literally translated as the kind of house face. So it's where people build their houses and sleep and that sort of thing. So it's actually the only territory that appears on contemporary maps, which is why I've included it here, which I think is quite interesting. So this much more complicated map on the left has sort of been replaced by a map that only includes the territories that have little black dots on them, which I think really speaks to what I'm talking about the consequences of kind of only taking a partial, only taking this land use system or applying it only partially. So all of these territories taken together are referred to as the Kato, which is translated as kind of the country or nation, but within this context, and something I also think is quite significant, it really only refers to where Jul'hoan speakers are found, right? So people who are in a broader kind of kinship relationship to one another. So really the idea of territory is completely inseparable from how people conceptualize their relationships to one another, which is not that surprising, but I think is lost in a lot of the participatory mapping kind of exercises. So there are then kind of 4 forms of relatedness that in turn kind of determine one's relationships or rights to particular regions or resources. It is worth saying that this is in theory and of course not always in practice, but it's worth kind of going over these now. So the first one of these are kind of consanguineous relationships, so basically relationships by blood. It is actually by blood. People describe kind of having, these are your relationships to parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and that sort of thing, and to the people who are related to them. And it's usually about 3 or 4 generations. And people describe these relationships, or Jul'hoan people describe these relationships as those between people who kind of have or own each other, which again, I think is quite significant. So these sorts of relationships give you kind of unequivocal rights to a Ngore. And these are the ones that are currently kind of captured by the the maps that exist. The second are affinal relationships, so relationships between those who are in-laws. And these also give you kind of unequivocal rights to a territory through your spouse or through the broader relatives. But it's worth noting that these are avoidance relationships. I won't get into joking and avoidance relationships, but these are kind of basically respect relationships. So you do have rights to these territories by marrying, and that is not reflected in the kind of broader maps, obviously, because they're not kind of ego-centered, but they have a different quality to them. Interestingly, the word to visit or stay with one's in-laws, which I've mentioned here, which is aya, is a term that kind of otherwise means or indicates kind of rights or choices or decisions or that sort of thing. So the last few are these kinds of name relationships. We'll start with name relationships. And these have been written about by many anthropologists, but basically the idea is that if somebody has, let's say if my mother's name is Anne, if I meet another person whose name is Anne, that person is my mother and I'm their daughter. That's a name relationship. And I've kind of mentioned these because they're often used as evidence to talk about this group of people as having systems of kind of universal kin classification, but I'm kind of not entirely convinced by these arguments, or I'm sort of looking into this. And the reason why is because it's quite clear when you consider differences in territory rights that these confer, that you see that actually there's a difference between an actual blood relationship and these kind of name relationships. It's possible that this has just changed over time, but this is kind of one of these forms. You get sort of equivocal rights to a Ngore, if you kind of share a name or whatever, but it's a very different kind of relationship. So it's not one that you would map as your territory if you were given the option. And then the last ones are really sharing relationships. So gift exchange relationships, which Vermeulen et al. Kind of talk about, and then demand sharing relationships, which are really relationships between, usually relationships between friends, but also between family, and they're based on kind of, if somebody demands something, you kind of have to give it, or you generally do give to them based on demand, whereas gift exchange is really, you don't ask for something, somebody just gives it to you if they think that you need it. And you don't gain kind of Ngore rights there, but you can visit, and it has been described as kind of an important way of sort of negotiating risk within this wider area. So coming to the last part of the talk, I still have 10 minutes, hopefully, if that's all right. In reciting, excellent, thanks, James. In reciting these kind of different forms of relatedness and concepts of territory to you, which I know is a lot, and I'm still trying to work them out, my hope is not kind of that you'll remember all of this, but rather that you'll get a sense for just how much more there may be to this Ngore land use system than its current application kind of suggests, and also give a sense for just how many consequences can come from the application of different forms of territory to wider kind of land use or land tenure processes. And that's what I'm kind of really interested in. The current system appears to capture the rights that people have by virtue of their kind of consanguineous relationships, which matches other forms of land tenure and land use kind of practices, but it doesn't go much further than this. And I'm really trying to think about whether it could be much more radical than this and what would it involve, really responding to the conversations that my own interlocutors are having around participatory mapping and what they could really do with it. So it has been highly effective. I just want to emphasize this, both in terms of the kind of early process of regaining ancestral rights and in terms of this, land use and land management processes as part of the kind of conservancy model, but there are kind of a few emergent issues that I think are worth exploring. So in the following closing section, I want to propose that there are kind of two primary ways in which this might be a bit problematic. So first is when it comes to the creation of new territories, right? So the territory map has actually remained largely static for quite a few decades. There have been changes to it, but these have been quite slow, and I'm really responding to a lot of unrest within this region about not being able to create new territories, not really having a basis for creating new territories, but also of having issues surrounding access to existing territories where family relationships have kind of changed. Either, populations have grown or families have kind of, drifted apart or that sort of thing. So in the past, this would have been less complicated because people, it was much more of a kind of rotational territory system, whereas now it's really not that, it's much more fixed. The second is where it comes, when it comes to kind of rising problems of inequality and the issue of having access to resources or opportunities by virtue of your access to a territory. So this is again going back to this point that the entity itself that is being mapped, your territory, also indexes lots of other sorts of relationships to people, relationships to resources, and that sort of thing that are not actually mapped by the kind of more simple maps. So to better appreciate these issues and the kind of effects that new experiments in participatory mapping may have, I want to briefly give two anecdotes from my more recent research. So the very kind of anthropological thing to do here. So the first is that over the course of I wonder if I can, yes. Over the course of the last decade, a number of applications have been made by members of the Naina Conservancy for new Ngoresi, so new territories. This pressure has come not only, again, as said, from these kind of changing relationships within specific territories, but from pressures people face to the kind of become entrepreneurs in various industries. So most notably in kind of cultural tourism, which requires that people have these kind of basically kind of pristine bush camps away from the realities of poverty that people face in the more established kind of residential territories. So tourists don't want to see people struggling, they want to see kind of pristine bush camps. So a lot of the pressure actually to create new territories, although not all, you know, some of it is to do with changing family relationships, is about industry and it's about enterprise, which I think is very significant in thinking about what the effects might be of using these tools, although I've not given it as much thought. So speaking of this experience of being rejected once, you know, one interlocutor who had been rejected in the process of applying for a new territory, one of my close interlocutors sort of said that we put in an application to the chief, but he cannot give us permission unless the people from the neighboring territory give us their permission. Their Ngore is less than 10 kilometers away from where we want to settle, and so they have the right to refuse us. They've just refused us. They say they don't want people from other places settling near their place. What they don't know, maybe they've forgotten, is that we're relatives. That place is our grandmother's place. They can't refuse us. So in other words, in focusing on these kind of fairly nuclear units, the maps have silenced what are kind of consanguineous relationships between people that confer upon them rights to territories between these respective territories, right? So there's a lot of, the discussion is really around a lot of forgetting that is happening as a consequence of these kind of processes of participatory mapping. So the second, briefly, it's really related to the kind of the way that the Conservancy operates. And one of the important things, obviously, is, you know, written into the Constitution is principles of kind of fairness and equity. And these are based, you know, loosely on these kind of broader principles of sharing that I've kind of referred to, and that this community have kind of long been known to live by. So each year, each member receives a kind of fair share of the profits accrued by the Conservancy, and an equal share of any kind of game that is collectively sort of hunted, and any tenders for kind of harvesting wild or you know, bush felt products and that sort of thing, bush foods. So while the latter is kind of shared between villages, the former is shared kind of equally between individual members, so long as they're in fact kind of members of a territory, which is actually not always the case. So this is meant to ensure that there's no kind of material discrimination between people. And it certainly achieves this with respect to the kind of Conservancy dividends, but it doesn't intervene in kind of other forms of inequality that develop in the face of these broader economic and political processes, but also are an effect of, you know, the kind of luck of which territory you end up with, and how it kind of works. And obviously gift exchange relationships and that sort of thing would have kind of mitigated these risks somewhat, and that's kind of not happening. And I think that that's interesting. And the anecdote here is really that people talk a lot about these growing divisions between the wealthy and the privileged. And they talk about these as divisions between families, but they also talk about them as divisions between actual territories and problems of relationships of the basis of that. So mapping relationships, in other words, kind of would give a better sense for a person's access to territory and the resources found therein, but also to a kind of wide range of other sources of support. And that's kind of another thing that people are interested in doing, but which is really challenging. So uncovering these silences, you know, would involve both recognizing kinship as a kind of, or relatedness, or the different forms of relatedness as a kind of determining factor in people's rights to particular regions and the kind of resources found therein, but also extending this beyond relationships within territories to consider relationships between them, right? And what came through in my discussions with Jul'hoan speakers was that this would not only give new meaning to these kind of so-called empty or unoccupied regions where people kind of are seeking to establish new territories, but it would also kind of give new meaning to the kind of network support that people might draw upon, and that shape kind of an individual's map of possible sources of support. So this is really kind of a local sort of intellectual exercise, but it is also sort of thinking through how this might be used at an institutional level. And this is where the paper kind of veers away from the anthropology and sort of just closes in thinking about what it would mean to actually develop these tools. So at a basic level, it's fairly simple, although Marcus might disagree with me, but the tools that, you know, would initially allow you to sort of, you know, collect point data can be developed further to allow users to kind of collect pathways or areas. You can add kind of categorical information to them about relationships and that sort of thing. You can add audio or photo or video, anything you find is important as part of this local discussion about territory. And then you can send the data to a local, you know, server or that sort of thing. So the basics of that seem fairly straightforward, and I'm happy to talk about that later. But what seems more challenging is you know, the kind of what would happen if people actually did this. So I just want to actually close with just a few reflections on a few challenges that seem particularly clear to me. So the first is sort of, you know, the fact that Jul'hoan speakers often say that nothing is kind of more important than knowing who you're related to and what consequences there might be either today or in the future of kind of mapping. What the idea is really asking what consequences will there be of mapping this in the future? And you know, the question is, what would it do to visually bring together kinship with territory mapping for people within the region? What would the consequences of that be? Another question is sort of how has the broader political and economic context and even the climate changed the way that people relate to the environment and to one another, that make this sort of effort to apply the rules of sociality to you know, the kind of more messiness of social life, you know, something that needs to be thought about. You know, what impact does this have on, what do these broader political and economic processes have on this land use system itself as people know it, and to the possible effects of applying it. A third one, which really relates to the efforts of the team to kind of, you know, design these tools in a collaborative way, is, you know, what does drawing upon ethnography in this way that I've kind of done in this paper kind of negate a participatory approach? You know, it's sort of has in mind what the rules of sociality are, and so you kind of build them into this tool. And how does that, you know, change actual participatory approaches, which would give you a much more open tool and allow people to sort of design it themselves? And finally, and this is one that's particularly relevant to my kind of broader anthropological research, which asks sort of what is the relationship between all these efforts that's, you know, that it seems to kind of fix what people regard as the rules of social life and social life as it actually is lived. You know, what is that kind of relationship, you know, where people are aware of these customs, but frequently kind of reinterpret them or negotiate them in the face of kind of shifting contexts, experiences of doubt, feelings of trust and that sort of thing. Like, where do these efforts to use mapping to kind of fix things or record things, where do they fit in with this kind of more messiness of social life? And maybe, you know, what I found is actually that people simply use these as starting points for conversation. But what this question is really, you know, what I'm asking with this question is what, you know, what are the kind of afterlives of fixing that kind of information in the same way as, you know, we've seen what the afterlives of the kind of participatory mapping processes are. So I'm going to leave it there at just a series of open questions about this general talk, and look forward to discussing it further.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Megan. That was really, really interesting stuff, and loads of kind of overlaps with my own experience of working with an indigenous group in Borneo who also went through a sort of similar process of mapping and trying to translate customary land categories into a very different sort of legal and sort of legible framework.